Today I'm talking about The Devil All the Time. The book was written by Donald Ray Pollock in 2012 and adapted by Netflix in 2020. The story follows a group of characters whose lives are separate but ultimately entwined as they go through the ups and downs of their lives in rural southern Ohio and West Virginia after the Second World War. Hey there, I'm Jessica, and this is Bookshelf to Big Screen. If you're new to the channel, I take a look at books that have been adapted to the big or small screen and compare the differences between the two. So if you're the kind of person who loves to know what changes were made in the movie or if the book really was better, be sure to subscribe. Real quick, if you want to avoid any spoilers, watch for this. I'll have it up during any revealing parts, and in the event you want to wait and read or watch for yourself, you can just skip forward until it's gone. So, there's a lot of terrible things going on in this story. There's a man who's seen and done terrible things in the war, whose wife is dying of cancer. There's some religious fanatics who commit murder. There's a husband-wife serial killing team. There's a preacher who abuses his position to take advantage of young girls. There's a corrupt sheriff who only has re-election on his mind. And there's a couple of kids caught up in it all. So let's get into it. The movie starts off by introducing us to Willard Russell. While in the war, he comes across a soldier flayed and hung up on a crucifix and has to kill him to end his misery. After this, he can never look at a crucifix without thinking of the soldier. When he comes back from the war, he meets Charlotte at a diner and he's moved by her kindness. On the drive home, Willard gives his Uncle Erskine a German Luger that he brought back with him. The book is told in 7 parts with a prologue. Each part is primarily centered around a particular character's story at that time. The movie is a little different because it interjects the other characters in at the appropriate part in the timeline, even though it's not necessarily their part of the story. This will be important a little later, so just keep it in mind. Willard's story is told in part 1, The Sacrifice. There are 2 main differences here. 1, the book gives much more detail on what Willard experiences in the war, and it's way more disturbing. 2, when Willard goes to the diner, he falls in love right away. There's no mention of any conversation that he has with Charlotte. She just serves him some dry meatloaf and mushy green beans, but in his mind, it was the best meal of his life because he was already in love. Also, there's only one other man in the diner. In the movie, Willard's mother promised God that if he sent her son home safely from the war, she'd get him to marry Helen, whose family all died in a house fire. But Willard is already in love with Charlotte, whose name he doesn't even know yet. It works out though because Helen, who's extremely pious, falls for a visiting preacher. Roy and his cousin Theodore travel together. Roy preaches while Theodore plays the guitar. Emma tells Willard that Theodore drank too much antifreeze to test his faith and that's why he can't walk anymore. Roy says that he used to fear spiders, but since the Lord gave him strength, he doesn't fear them anymore. Then he dumps a jar of spiders on his head. In the book, this all happens mostly the same, but we get quite a bit of the story from the regular preacher's point of view, which is pretty much absent from the movie. Another interesting difference is that we learn a lot more about Theodore, who plays a much larger role in the story in the book. Through his inner monologue and the narrator, we learn that he's actually in love with Roy. The movie jumps forward to when Willard and Charlotte are already married with a baby boy named Arvin. Emma reads a letter from Willard with Helen and her new baby Lenora. At their new home in Ohio, Willard has a place in the woods where he can finally talk to God again. We jump forward again, and Arvin is a boy now. They're praying in the woods when a couple of hunters walk nearby, saying vulgar things about Charlotte. Later, Willard takes Arvin out. He finds the hunters at the local bar and starts beating one. When the second one tries to get away, Willard takes their shotgun and uses it to beat him. He tells Arvin that if someone starts shit with him, he needs to finish it. He just might have to wait for the right time. It's a lesson that Arvin doesn't forget. The book gives much more time to Willard's story. Right after the spiders in church, Willard goes back to see Charlotte and a few weeks later sends Emma the letter saying that they're married. Helen is there when Emma gets the letter, but she's there to tell Emma that she's engaged to Roy. Willard and Charlotte don't actually move to the house they rent until Arvin is 4. The entire part with the hunter is actually told in the prologue, so it really sets the stage for the book. It happens slightly differently though. Willard beats the first guy and then smashes his gun against a tree. The second guy drives away while Willard is working on the first. Later in the book, we find out that the guy he beat was never really right after that. I think he had serious brain damage. In the movie, when they get home, Charlotte is passed out on the floor. The doctor tells Willard that she has cancer and that it's too far along for them to do anything. Willard tells Arvin that they can save her with their praying. Willard takes this incredibly seriously. After a while, he believes that he needs to give God a sacrifice. So he shoots Arvin's dog and asks God to take the dog instead of Charlotte. But Charlotte dies anyway. This happens very differently in the book. Arvin finds Charlotte when he comes home from the last day of school. He has to sit with Charlotte unconscious and bleeding until his dad gets home from work. The whole prayer and sacrifice thing is taken to extreme lengths. Charlotte suffers the entire summer, and all the while, Willard is making Arvin scream pray with him day and night. His first sacrifice is the blood of a lamb, which he pours on his prayer log. Then he erects 8 more giant crosses. Willard can't afford to keep buying lambs, so he starts collecting roadkill. And since they don't have enough blood, he starts nailing them to the crosses and hanging them from the trees, along with pouring whatever blood he can onto the crosses and logs. It's pretty terrifying. There's also this whole side story with Willard's terrible landlord. The landlord's wife is cheating on him with the gardener, and the landlord thinks he might get Willard to kill his wife and pin it on the gardener after he hears about how badly Willard had beat the hunter. He offers to give Willard the house if he does it, but Willard decides to kill the landlord. He drains his blood for his altar and then dumps the body in the ravine. They actually arrested the wife and gardener for that murder later. As for the dog, it was a stray that Arvin had for a day, not the family dog. But Arvin did bond with it and was very upset about it. In the movie, after the funeral, Arvin is still mad at his dad about the dog. He goes inside and eats a pie that someone left them. When it's dark and his dad hasn't come inside yet, he goes out to look for him. He sees his dad at the prayer log and starts shouting that he's not going to pray anymore. But when he reaches him, he sees that he's killed himself. The sheriff is called, and soon after, Arvin is sent to live with his grandmother, who also looks after Lenora. All of this happens in the book. The order of things is just slightly different than the movie. In the movie, we go back to when Lenora was just a baby. Roy has locked himself up in the closet because he's been bitten by a spider while preaching, so he thinks the Lord is testing him. Theodore is shown sharpening a screwdriver, and Roy finally comes out because he's received God's message. Helen leaves Lenora with Emma so that they can go for a drive. As they walk into the woods, Roy stops Helen to pray. As she's about to kiss him, he stabs her in the neck with the screwdriver. Then he tries to resurrect her. Theodore wakes up and sees what's happened. He tells Roy that he can't go back home because he can't explain it as an accident. When Theodore wakes up the next morning, Roy is gone, and he's picked up by Carl and Sandy. At the beginning of the movie, Sandy meets Carl on the very same day Willard meets Charlotte, in the same diner. The narrator tells us that Carl is the shooter, Sandy is the bait, and they call their victims models. They pick up hitchhikers, and then Carl takes pictures of them having sex with Sandy before he kills them. Roy refuses to have sex with Sandy, so Carl just kills him. The narrator says that this was early on in their killing career, so Carl was still learning to be more selective with his models. This is completely different from the book. We already know that Theodore is in love with Roy. Well, because of this, he hates Helen. He's actually sharpening the screwdriver because the last time he played his guitar at a party, people started messing with him, so he wanted to be able to defend himself. When Roy comes out of the closet, he tells Theodore that God told him he has the power of resurrection, but he wants to practice on a cat. Theodore says a cat won't prove anything and tells him that he should try it out on Helen because she's so pious, it would definitely work. Theodore only pretends to be asleep when they get to the woods because he actually wants to watch. The way Helen dies is a bit more disturbing too. Roy leaves the screwdriver in her neck. She falls, gets right back up, pulls the screwdriver out of herself, and then falls again. And then she crawls a few feet before she collapses and dies. When Roy can't revive her, Theodore tells him to go get the shovel that he put in the trunk because he was prepared for this and bury her. They drive south and actually spend the rest of the book together, living on the run. At one point, they join a carnival and Roy eats insects while preaching to draw a crowd. Roy has a relationship with the flamingo lady and Theodore has one with Flapjack the clown. They're with the carnival for a while until Theodore sexually assaults a little boy and they get kicked out and blacklisted from all the carnivals. Later, towards the end of the book, Roy is making good money picking fruit on a farm, but Theodore, whose health has been rapidly declining, finally dies. Without having to worry about Theodore anymore, Roy decides that he can finally go home, because even if he spends the rest of his life in jail, he just wants to see Lenora one more time. But that's when Carl and Sandy pick him up, and that part is pretty much the same with the exception that he's actually one of their last victims instead of one of their first. The movie jumps forward to when Arvin is a teenager. On his birthday, Uncle Erskine gives him the Luger that Willard had given to him. Lenora is picked on at school because she's so religious, just like her mother was. Arvin is always there to look out for her though. Lenora talks about how she prays her dad will come home one day and that she's already forgiven him. All of this happens in the book, but Lenora is actually picked on much more before this particular incident. Arvin has actually been kicked out of school several times for fighting on her behalf. When this incident with the three boys happened, they actually may have beat him to death, but the janitor happened to come out and scare them away. In the movie, the preacher tells Lenora that he'll be gone a while, but his nephew is going to come and take his place. He says he'd appreciate it if they'd make him feel welcome and to ask her grandmother to bring a dish. Emma stresses over what to bring, but finally decides on chicken livers. When Emma presents her dish, Preacher Teagarden sticks his fingers in it, which is disgusting, by the way, and he's inspired to do a sermon on it. He tells the congregation that he's going to sacrifice himself and eat the chicken livers so that everyone else can have some of the good meat. Emma is so embarrassed, but Arvin comforts her. In the book, the preacher announces to the entire congregation that he's going to be gone a while and that his nephew will be filling in. I think having him tell Lenora in the movie puts the responsibility on Lenora to make the new preacher feel welcome, which is important later. Emma does not present her dish either. All the dishes are just placed on the tables. In the book, we don't need the subtle push on Lenora or the disgusting finger lick because we know right away how terrible Preacher Teagarden is. Arvin notices right away how young Teagarden's wife seems to be. And Teagarden, in his inner monologue, brags about how quickly he got her to do things after he helped baptize her when she was 15 and finally married her a year later so that he could work on her without her parents sticking their noses in. Arvin also notices how Teagarden perks up when two young teenage girls enter the church, and then quickly announces he's going to start a youth group because young people are the lifeblood of any church. In a book full of bad people and terrible things happening, this guy is the fucking worst of them all. In the movie, Arvin takes his father's advice and waits for the right time to get back at the three boys who picked on Lenora. He takes the first boy by surprise while he's trying to get with a girl on a bus and beats him with a tire iron. He gets the other two while they're working on a car. He slams the hood on the first one and goes after the other. He puts bags over both of their heads and beats one and then chokes the other while threatening to kill him if he ever touches his sister again. In the book, these attacks happen a little differently. While the first boy is drinking a soda, Arvin shoves the bottle into his face, breaking some teeth, and then knocks him out. The boy wakes up in a ditch, choking on his own blood with a bag over his head. The second boy is on the bus, and that pretty much happens the same way. The last boy is working on his car when Arvin attacks him. There's no description of it, but Arvin beats him so badly he has to go to the hospital, and he also puts over a dozen paper bags over his head so tightly that the doctor said he was lucky he hadn't suffocated. In the movie, while Arvin is dealing with the bullies, Lenora gets caught in the rain while visiting her mother's grave. Teagarden takes this opportunity to take advantage of Lenora. He drives her out to the woods and asks her if she's truly opened herself up to the Lord by showing herself as the Lord made her. The difference in the book here is that Arvin didn't leave Lenora alone. He actually dealt with the bullies before the preacher even came to town. Lenora actually waits inside the schoolhouse until Arvin gives up on her and leaves because she wants to go see Teagarden. Teagarden has been leaving the church doors open every day, knowing that Lenora would eventually come inside. In the movie, we go back to Carl and Sandy. Sandy considers leaving Carl, but chickens out in the end. Later, she's looking through the photos of their models when the sheriff drops in. Lee is actually Sandy's brother. He tells her that he's been getting calls that she was prostituting herself out of the bar she works at. She says it's not true, but he tells her not to be doing anything that could interfere with his upcoming election. He leaves, but he takes a photo he found and tries to figure out what Sandy is doing. He's worried about it because if somebody finds out about what she might be doing, they might start looking more closely at him and his dealings with a man named Leroy. Lee goes to a bar to see Leroy, but there's a guy guarding the door who beats Lee up. He later finds him at a diner to take his cut from Leroy's illegal dealings, but Leroy tells him that he's taking part of it for the business that he'll be losing since the sheriff was asking about girls at the bar. Later, he kills Leroy. I'm not going to talk more about what Carl and Sandy do. It's in the movie if you want to watch it. In the book, Sandy never really considers leaving Carl. It does go into detail about how they moved to California right after they got married, thinking Carl would make it as a photographer. They very quickly went broke, and this is the first time that Carl sells Sandy. It's horrifying what ends up happening to them, but they leave California, and on their way back to Ohio is when they pick up their first hitchhiker. These people are serial killers, but they're not even the worst people in the book. The book gives us so much more character development, and I actually just feel so sad for Sandy and everything that she's been through. The book also gives several more accounts of some of the models that they've had. Lee is mostly the same, but he doesn't get beat up by the big guy at the bar or upset Leroy. He does think about how he may have to kill Leroy one day, but never actually does it. There's also more about his dealings with Leroy in the book. Namely, he's killed a few people for Leroy. In the movie, Lenora gets pregnant, and Teagarden tries to tell her that she's crazy and she imagines the whole thing, saying that he couldn't be the father when all they've done is spend time with the Lord. Even though he denies culpability, his advice to her is to find a way to get rid of it so that her grandmother doesn't die from shame. Later, she's too sick and skips church. While she's alone, she goes out to the shed to hang herself. She realizes she's making a mistake because her grandmother wouldn't be ashamed and she'd be okay, but she slips and it's too late. Arvin is the one who finds her. In the book, Teagarden not only tells her that she's crazy, but he says, why would he ever touch her when he's got a wife at home who's 100 times prettier? When she leaves the church, she sees another teen girl going into the church. It's one of the two girls that Teagarden had perked up over earlier. That same night, after everyone's asleep, she goes out to the smokehouse to hang herself. But she changes her mind, thinking she'll wait another day or two. She thinks Teagarden was probably just upset and didn't really mean it and that he'd change his mind, but that's when she slips. In the book, it's Uncle Erskine that finds her. In the movie, the local sheriff catches Arvin after work and tells him that the coroner discovered Lenora was pregnant. He says, the three of them are the only ones who ever need to know, and Arvin thanks him for thinking of his grandmother's feelings. Arvin tells the sheriff how Teagarden wouldn't even speak at Lenora's funeral because it was a suicide, but then he starts to think about something. He starts following Teagarden and sees that he's been meeting with another teenage girl. Arvin spends his last evening with his Uncle Erskine and then leaves a goodbye note for Emma before loading the Luger and going to see Teagarden. He pretends to confess to doing all the things that he's seen Teagarden do. When Teagarden realizes he's talking about him, Arvin pulls the gun. Teagarden tries to say that both Lenora and the other girl just wouldn't leave him alone and that Lenora said another boy was the father of her baby. Teagarden throws a book to try to distract Arvin, but he manages to get a shot off and then shoots him 2 more times. He picks up the shells and then leaves. In the book, Arvin follows Teagarden and discovers that he's seen the new girl and her younger sister, who's only 14. He does spend his last evening at home with his uncle, but he doesn't write a goodbye note to his grandmother. He waits for Teagarden at the place he likes to park. The older sister comes by to tell Teagarden that her sister told her mother everything because the bleeding wouldn't stop. She says that her mother took her sister to the hospital, but the sheriff is her mom's cousin and he'll probably be coming soon. After she leaves, Teagarden is thinking about how he needs to leave town quickly, but that is when Arvin confronts him. He shoots out his tires before finally shooting Teagarden in the head. He only manages to find 1 shell before he has to leave. In the movie, Arvin heads back to his childhood home to put things right with the things his dad did. On the way, his car breaks down and he starts hitchhiking. Of course, it's Carl and Sandy that pick him up. Carl says they're going to have to pull over so he can pee. Arvin sees Carl's gun when he gets out of the car, which starts to make him wary, so he pulls out his own gun. When Carl comes back around with a gun to make Arvin get out, Arvin quickly shoots him twice. Sandy pulls out her own gun, and they both shoot. But then the narrator tells us that Carl stopped trusting Sandy, and he put blanks in her gun. So Sandy is dead, but Arvin is unharmed. Arvin searches Carl and finds one of his souvenir photographs in his wallet. He wipes down the back seat and then checks Sandy's purse and the glove box. He finds 2 rolls of film and then leaves. In the book, Arvin starts thinking that something is weird before they even stop, because Carl says he's not from the area but tells Sandy about a road up ahead for her to pull off onto. When they stop, Carl says that he wants to take some pictures and asks if Arvin wants to get out and take some pictures with Sandy. He says he just wants to hurry up and get back on the road, but Carl offers to have Sandy take her clothes off. Arvin tries to get out of the car, saying he'll just walk back to the highway, but Carl says he didn't mean to upset him and he'll just go pee. Arvin is barely pulling his gun out when Carl comes around with his gun and tells Arvin to get out of the car. Then Arvin swings the door open, steps out, and shoots him twice. He's already out of the car when Sandy starts screaming. She actually fires once before Arvin reacts, but he shoots her before she manages a second shot. In the book, Carl swapped her bullets for blanks before they left home that summer, so we already know that Sandy pulling her gun will amount to nothing. In the movie, Lee arrives at the scene and they tell him it's his sister. He starts to think about the photo he found before and goes to their apartment looking for anything that might be bad for him. He finds the negatives of all their photos in Carl's dark room, and he takes everything and burns it. Later, Lee gets a call from another sheriff telling him that Arvin is suspected for killing Teagarden and that he may be headed there because he used to live there. He becomes more interested when he finds out Teagarden was killed with a 9mm, the same kind of gun that killed Sandy. Lee remembers Arvin from the night his dad died and heads out to the house. In the book, this all happens, but the big difference here is that Lee really cares about his sister, and finding her really upsets him. He tells the coroner to make arrangements for her, but when the coroner asks him about Carl, Lee tells him to make sure he gets a pauper's grave. No marker, no name, nothing. In the movie, Arvin finally makes it back to his hometown. He chats with the shopkeeper who helped him the night his dad died and thanks him for what he did. When he gets to his dad's old prayer log, he finds his dog's remains and starts to bury them. He hears something and hides. Lee calls out to him, saying he's there to just ask him a few questions. Arvin pulls his gun and then tosses a stick to test him. Lee immediately shoots where the stick landed, showing he's not there to take Arvin in. Arvin shouts for him to put his gun down, starts telling him why he had to kill Teagarden and his sister. Lee comes up on him and they both shoot, but only Arvin hits his mark. As he's dying, Arvin shows him the photograph, telling him Carl and Sandy were going to kill him and that he had no choice. He leaves the photo and the rolls of film with Lee. Arvin buries the Luger with his dog and then heads back to the road to hitchhike. The movie ends with him getting picked up, and while he tries not to doze off, he thinks maybe the law will see what he had done was good, or that maybe he'll marry a girl and have a child, or that he might enlist. Ultimately, he thinks that he just needs some sleep and that he was lucky someone was giving him a ride. In the book, the only real difference between this last confrontation with Arvin and Lee is that Arvin is standing behind a tree hiding, and he manages to come up behind Lee, so it's not really a question of whether he might not get away from Lee. The book ends with Arvin walking back to the road, but he doesn't have the same deep thoughts or actually get to the road to get picked up again. The last line is, if he was lucky, someone would give him a ride. Well, this story is pretty horrible. And by that I mean what's happening in the story. I watched this movie and it made me feel so gross. I honestly didn't think I was going to make it through the book and seriously considered just skipping this review. But I started reading the book the next night, and I stayed up until nearly 3 in the morning because I couldn't put it down. I actually had to make myself stop so that I could get some sleep. The book is even more disturbing because there's actually many more horrific things than the movie shows. But the writing is so compelling. Donald Ray Pollock does such an incredible job developing these characters. I actually think that it was good that I did read the book, because even though I had to read about more terrible things, I really got a better understanding of these people. And I feel like it gave me the appropriate distance that I needed, as opposed to just having it kind of shoved in your face the way the movie made me feel. Ultimately, I think this is a really good read, but you need to be prepared to deal with the mental and emotional toll the contents of this book will have on you. The movie was very well done and it was a good adaptation, but because of the subject matter, it was difficult for me to watch. I will give you one bit of fun trivia. Donald Ray Pollock, the author, is actually the voice of the narrator in the movie. So that's pretty cool. Well, there you have it. That's my recap on The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock and the 2020 movie adaptation. If you read or watched this one, I'd really like to know what you thought about it. So leave me some comments so I know I'm not the only one feeling this way. If you haven't read or watched it yet, I've included links to both the book and the movie in the description below so you can check them out too. If you enjoyed this review, please click like and be sure to click subscribe to see my next video. Thanks for watching.